Hello, hello, Ederson Oliveira here. This is the monthly TADUG meetup. Today is December the 6th, 2018, and it's 6:33 in the afternoon. This is the last one for the year. So we are going through the holiday season right now. People are busy buying stuff that will just collect dust after New Year, but that's fine. That's how we work. In any case, let's go here to our TADUG meetup for the initial things that we go through. As usual, the same structure as always. Some acknowledgements, announcements, a little bit of group time. Presentation will be done by Mr. Mike Smeltzer talking about the DNN Building Blocks. And then we wrap things up. Just a quick acknowledgement to the sponsors. DNN for Less, great hosting provider from, I don't know what's his role there, Jesse, but yeah, I wanted to thank Jesse for his sponsorship, their sponsorship. Is DNN Solutions as well for some modules that they have provided for the website, and Andrew Hoffling for having helped us putting the website together. So, just a quick note here about DNN 9.3. There is a new date that has been set since our last meeting. The release candidate has been set to December 17th, so we are about 10 days away from a potential release candidate of DNN 9.3. Do you know anything about this release, Daniel, or anybody else out there?
Yeah, right now there's a lot of work done in the persona bar. Something that most people won't notice, but we're basically upgrading all the dependencies to the latest React versions, the latest Webpack, the latest everything. And well, it's not a big change for a user, but we needed to do that before moving into actually improving the persona bar.
Got it.
So it's a lot of long hours for something that doesn't appear, but it's a lot of work, but we have to do it. And that's what pushed a little bit the release date for 9.3. And we're estimating the date you said, depending how it goes.
Got it. So it's bringing the persona bar up to what? To you're talking about
React 16.6.3, the most recent version of everything.
Got it. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so I guess that eventually there are other things that will be taken care of in the persona bar. And
yeah, there's a couple things that were merged. Whatever comes in until the code freeze will try to merge that in as possible. But the big focus now is completing that to be able to release 9.3.
Got it. Awesome. Very good. Very good. So just want to make it quick and short here for the announcements. I wanted to mention this. I came across this tool service which is free, and I came across that about a month ago. And I just spoke today with Chris Hammond. He will be doing a presentation on this tool called Let's Encrypt, and I'm gonna just share the browser here for a second. I wanted to bring this tool to your attention, and maybe some of you have seen this service before, maybe not, but it's so awesome. Imagine this. Imagine that now you can have SSL certificates for free forever by using Let's Encrypt. No catch. Well, there is a little catch there. Their certificate, it expires within 90 days from the time that you create it. But there are things that you can do if you have a Windows server, or if you are hosting on Azure. There are things that you can do to automatically renew the certificate. But what this is, it's a free SSL certificate. Just think about that. Think about that. At least I had on my sites on an annual renewal my certificates. So I always had to go manually and do one by one, and they always cost money. And because of certain things maybe I was doing wrong, I had to have a different IP address for each site that I wanted to have certificates. So a lot of headache, a lot of actually some money to there. Not a lot of money, but some money too. With Let's Encrypt, you can again install SSL on your site for free forever. The only catch, as I said, it expires in 90 days. But if you have a Windows server or if you have Azure, you can automate that. So very good, very, very stable. I mean, I followed the instructions. It worked the first time around. Very good. I don't know if any one of you guys have seen this service before.
Yeah, I have a couple things to say on that. I use it, and if you're on Windows directly hosting, there's a Windows program called Certify the Web, which will do the renewals automatically for you with a scheduled task and everything. And more than that, it will also take that SSL and configure it in IIS for your hosting websites and everything. It's like really a one-click thing. It's really easy to use. You can have multiple domains on the same SSL and stuff. It's really, really well done. It's also free for, I think, 3 domains, and then the paid version is really inexpensive. It's really worth it. And most control panels like Plesk and stuff like this have that built in also to do the automatic renewals and stuff.
Got it. So this tool that you were talking about, is it the one that does the renewal on your behalf? Is it the one?
It does the request, the renewal, and the setup.
Oh, okay.
It does everything.
Great.
It's very nice.
Awesome. If you can share,
Certify the Web. Yeah, I'll send you a link.
Yeah, share the link because then I can put in the recording notes. Okay.
Yeah, in the Windows world, it's really.
Yeah, and when I saw first time Let's Encrypt, I saw that it was very much for the Apache, the Linux world, but there are Windows extensions already created, and the one that I got worked flawlessly the first time around as well. So yeah. Thank you for that, Daniel. I'm gonna add that.
Windows service with the UI to configure. It works good.
Let me open here so I can keep in the recording as well. So certify the web. Great. Awesome. I don't know. I mean, I don't know who's behind Let's Encrypt, but I wonder because it's free. I mean,
I know Google is behind it with many other partners.
Actually, I've noticed that, Shopify is using that for all their sites. You know, if you go to a Shopify site and if you have a look at the certificate, you're going to see that it's Let's Encrypt.
Yeah.
Anyway, and as I said, Chris Hammond will be doing a session on how to use Let's Encrypt within Azure and how to automate the renewal by using Azure services as well. On that note, just wanted to mention that today, it was the first day that I've started doing the DNN Summit talks, and I just talked to the presenters, to the speakers, and I interviewed them. I talked to them about their sessions, what they want people to get out of their sessions. So I had a good conversation today in the morning with Ryan Moore and Chris Hammond. They are together. They are doing about 8 sessions together. So it was a good conversation. I'll be running another 6 conversations like that, and they will be published live as I get them done. Okay, so that's a resource that I wanted to share with you guys. And by the way, if anybody out there from the group here has any suggestions, recommendations of things that they find interesting, if they want to share that throughout the month with me, I can collect them and I can post them all together at the same time here when I talk about resources in general. Okay, so let's get moving here. Okay, new members. New members, I just want to briefly mention here a new member, one new member. And I know him in person. So I'm talking about, let's open here. Phil, and Phil, I have your last name here. Let me see if I'm gonna bastardize your last name. Phil Wedgerzin. Phil, very good to have you joining the group as well. And I hope that in one of those days you'll show up here as well. He is from Illinois. Let me see here. And let's get started with the main presentation. But before that, I just want to say to wish happy birthday to Mr. Smeltzer. Yes, Mike, I know this week, not today. I know it's not today. It was not today, but it was this week, correct?
How did you know that?
I know I'm a spy, you know. I keep checking on people, you know.
It was 2 days ago, yeah. Thank you, so, appreciate it.
See, that's to be honest, that's one thing that social media is very good at, you know. It's telling people's birthdays. Anyway,
and you're on my social media, so that makes sense.
See, so finally, now you can drive. Now you got to 18, so you can drive now. Woohoo! Anyway, congratulations. I hope that you had a good celebration. I know that you are about to get a very special present, gift, that will not be collecting dust after New Year. It's a forever type of gift. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Mike?
Yeah, if it's collecting dust, then I'm in big trouble. I'm having my first child. My wife and I are on due January 1st. So maybe a New Year's baby. So it's pretty exciting. I've been experiencing the amount of stuff you need to do, or you think you need to do, in order to get ready. So it's been quite a juggle the last few weeks between my work life, my personal life, and new baby coming. So it's I'm just getting a taste. I'm sure there's way more to come.
Very good, Mike. Very good. And we all wish you a very, all the luck on this exciting new phase of your life. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Before I jump to the main presentation, I skip one little part here. I always want to acknowledge who came live online here with us. So let me just run through the list here. We have Daniel Veladas, which is showing his face. We have, of course, actually, let me go top to bottom. Daniel Veladas, Gary, I know you, Gary. You're from Toronto. Good to have you here. Mark Welsin. Thank you, Mark, for being here. Mark Howell. Thank you, Mark. Always good to have you around. Mike Smeltzer, of course, and Steve Karpik. Steve, as I mentioned to you, I have one guest lined up. That was your suggestion, and we are just trying to work out the right date for him to show up. But he was very excited with your note and with that recommendation. Okay.
Oh, that'd be terrific. I'm looking forward to it.
We are talking about Daniel Mettler. I'm negotiating a date with Daniel Mettler for at some point, maybe after February, because he's skiing in the Swiss Alps, you know. Okay, great. So, Mike, let me give you your intro here. Let's see. So, again, building blocks, the DNN Building Blocks, common extensions in more unknown areas. Now, let's talk a little bit about Mike's bio here. I'm reading this, I'm quoting this. Well, the session first. He'll be touching upon the common extensions such as modules and themes, but also jump into more unknown areas such as analytic providers, system events, connectors, and more. So that's for the session. About Mike. Mike is an IT consultant based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which I had the pleasure to be there in person a few months ago. In Canada, who specializes in the DNN platform, full stack .NET development, system integration, and business process automation. His IT experience covers both operational and project work within many industries, including telecommunications, video games, healthcare, and insurance. Outside of consulting engagements, Mike also enjoys product development and currently working to bring a new DNN control panel experience called Shine to the market. Mike enjoys collaborating with others in all aspects of software development, and he has a diverse skill set and is interested in governance and change management, front and back end development, usability, and automation. Woohoo! That's a bio. That's what I call a bio. Mike, welcome, man. Good to have you here for the second time. You are so far the speaker of TADUG with the most appearances. So let me make you presenter. Okay. Yes, and I think it's on you right now, Mike. Okay, perfect.
Oh, you can see my screen now?
We can, yes.
Yep.
Right. Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for coming tonight, and to those who are watching the recording. As Anderson mentioned, we're here to talk about the building blocks in DNN. I'm Mike Smeltzer. I don't think I can beat the introduction that Anderson just gave me. So if you're looking for more information, you can just go to my website at mikesmeltzer.com. So I like to start these conversations with a definition so that we can all get on kind of the same playing field to know what we're talking about. So if you Google the word or the term building blocks, you'll come up with a definition is something like a basic unit from which something that is built. So I've taken that definition and did my own spin on it and relating it to DNN. So when I'm talking about the building blocks in DNN, I'm talking about any single feature within the DNN platform that is available to assist you in building your solution. So basically anything in DNN that we can use. So why building blocks? You know, when I've been using DNN for close to a decade now, and when I first started using .NET Nuke, I inherited a website, a large website that was built by a consulting firm and delivered to the corporation I was working for at the time as a full-time employee. So my experience in learning DNN was really from jumping into the code of an existing website and seeing how this vendor delivered this project to us. Along with that came some really good examples, and quite frankly, probably some really poor examples too, which is great to learn from. And to augment my hands-on training, I would have gone on this. We're talking like 2010, 2011. I would have gone on the internet through Google, through the DNN software website, and Googled terms such as intro to DNN development, DNN platform getting started, how to build a website in DNN, and a lot of the same type of information was coming back to me. Good information, mind you, but a lot of the same types of information. And a lot of it didn't talk about necessarily at a high level how to actually think about architecting and designing a web application in .NET Nuke, but more kind of, how to build a module, how to build a theme, how to build a container, just, kind of down different good tracks, but tracks that didn't necessarily talk about the other building blocks around DNN at the same time. So a few years ago,
Mark,
I watched a presentation online by Joe Brinkman. I believe he did this at one of the DNN Connect conferences. I forget what year it was, but it was entitled Thinking Outside of the DNN Box. And I took away from that presentation, you know, I'd been for years building DNN solutions, you know, very cookie cutter. Here's how the tutorial said to do it, so here's how we have to do it. But Joe presented the idea of, you know what, sometimes you should step back, and even though there's a recommendation or, hey, here's how the majority of people are doing something, sometimes you need to think outside the box and look around the entire ecosystem to see what's at your disposal before necessarily kind of just jumping into a certain track of development. So that got me kind of thinking a little bit, you know, and not necessarily questioning, but looking around and saying, okay, I've been doing things a certain way for a while now. Maybe there's other ways to do things, or maybe there's other ways to do things depending upon my use case. So part of that, I started thinking about, you know, in DNN, you know, it has an ecosystem. There's a store, there's commercial vendors, there's open source solutions. And a lot of things out there, you know, might necessarily be geared towards, hey, here's how you build a module, but maybe a lot of the things that are being talked about are, here's how to build it in a way that, you know, you're shipping a commercial module, or you're building a module that is intended to go to a number of websites which you have no idea about. So for instance, if I'm building a module, I might package it up using, you know, the kind of native DNN installer. I might use all of my SQL scripts and put those embedded in my module. And through the standard practice in DNN of listing those SQL scripts inside my manifest. So if I'm giving this module to Anderson to install on his website, which I have no idea about, it will install seamlessly. So a lot of the tutorials are kind of geared kind of that way. You know, here's how to build a shippable solution to someone. And that's how I was building things for quite some time. However, the majority of solutions I was building were not shippable commercial or shippable open source. They were custom implementations meant for a single website or a group of websites where either myself or the team that I was working on owned or had access to the entire stack of the solution. So the only thing that was getting delivered was the things that the team I was on was delivering. So it got me thinking, you know, maybe there's a better way to do things. And in the example that I just used, you know, the SQL scripts, you know, I've worked as a consultant for about 5 years now, but before as a full-time employee, we had operational practices. So for instance, maybe I want to deploy those SQL scripts with my extensions, not through DNN, but through a tool that the company I was with at the time used to track SQL scripts. There's a few tools out there. There's some by Redgate. I think SQL Up is another one. There's a deployment tool I'm very familiar with called Octopus Deploy that you can deploy scripts through. And, you know, using those tools was great for my use case at the time because it enabled us to do disaster recovery rollbacks. Something that, you know, if I had have embedded my SQL scripts inside my module, if that module installation failed, I couldn't really roll that back gracefully. So it kind of got me thinking again, you know, think about my use case. And, you know, yes, there's great documentation out there. Yes, there's great standards and best practices, but everyone's application or the way they're delivering something is not going to be the same. And, you know, I was trying to, taking Joe's presentation into account, okay, get out of that mind frame a little bit that, you know, I have to be in this cookie cutter box and think about my entire ecosystem, not just kind of my .NET ecosystem. And when I start to do that, you know, other things start coming into play. So I mentioned that the commercial and custom implementation route, but what about, you know, things like platform agnostic standards and regulations? And what I mean by that is, you know, there are technology standards out there that regardless of whether you're working on a DNN website or a static website, ASP.NET app, a WordPress website, whatever it is, there's standards out there. Most common and obvious one to me would be HTML. There's a standard for HTML. The W3C has, you go to their website, you can see all about HTML standards. JavaScript has standards. CSS has standards. Now, these are technology standards. Then you can think about, what about jurisdictional regulations? So, a hot topic these days is accessibility. Different jurisdictions, we're in Toronto area right now. I'm in Halifax, but this is out of Toronto. The Ontario government has in law regulations that for businesses in Ontario, you must build websites. And I'm not a legal expert, so there's a lot of different conditions about what level and things. But at the end of the day, you must adhere to these. And if you don't, you could face substantial fines. I believe that the same types of regulations exist in parts of the States and Europe and other parts of the world. So, now I have to take into account not just the platform I'm building something on, but also who and where this code is going, and also what regulations, what standards are surrounding it. So I really had to step back here and, I want to plan my solutions a bit better. So, if I'm building a shed in the backyard, I can probably get away with either doing no design or maybe a napkin sketch. But if I want to build a multi-tier deck or a house or, a larger architectural feat like a large apartment building, we have architects, we have engineers, we have building inspectors, we have blueprints, real heavy design. Because there's safety issues. There's standard code, just like standard HTML code, just like accessibility code. So I really started stepping back and thinking about my solutions more holistically, doing more solution design. And I say find the right balance in solution design when I'm doing this, because no one wants to get stuck in the mud doing what I would call analysis paralysis and just documenting and analyzing, you'll never get to the end. So I'm suggesting, you should probably do a solution design regardless of the scope of work really that you're doing, especially on the internet. Now, if I'm building a single page or I'm building 100 pages, there's still the same standards out there. There's still the same best practices. There's still the same penalties for me as a business if I don't meet them in some jurisdictions. So I really need to do that solution design. And as part of that, that'll help me hopefully find the right tool for the right job. And what I mean by that is, in my past, I would just jump right into building a DNN module, for instance. But then, you might find out later on, that probably wasn't the best way to do that. Maybe I could have used a different solution in DNN to achieve the same result and gone a different track. So if I kind of holistically do more design up front and think about these topics, and design doesn't necessarily mean architecture diagrams and a 50-page manual. It could just be a checklist of here's the things I have to do, or here's the checklist of business requirements depending upon the scope of work it is, and kind of just theoretically kind of high-level map these things out a little bit. They might start to trigger different thoughts and ideas about how you might want to implement something. So that's when I started saying to myself, instead of thinking in modules and skins, some of the common items, I'm going to start thinking in building blocks, and both DNN building blocks, so the features in DNN, but also, building blocks, taking my requirements, kind of chunking them down into small blocks so I can map those to my DNN building blocks. So that kind of takes me, into what are some of the common DNN building blocks. Simple, from Google and, going to the websites, you're going to find, as mentioned earlier, some really common things that come up in the DNN world. Some of the ones that jump out right to me are DNN being multi-portal. That's a core fundamental building block in my mind. I know right away that I can host one or many separate websites with different domain names inside of one DNN application. That doesn't mean I'm going to go out necessarily and take 100 different clients and put them on one application, but my use case might mean that for you, a single client, maybe you have 2 websites running on that, and that's a good thing in your case. So I know that I have that flexibility. I know that DNN is based on virtual pages. So really there's only kind of one physical page in DNN, and it's the default .aspx page. And I know that as a solution developer, I don't want to modify that because it's the core file, but all the pages in my solution are going to exist in the database. So that's pretty common stuff here. I also know that DNN is extensible and you can install extensions into it. So from some simple searches online, I find that most of the common types of extensions that are talked about are themes, previously known as skins. Themes are basically defining the look and feel of your site. They define where you can, they define content panes, so spots on your site where you can add content. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the only way to add content, because once again, it comes down to how someone's architected it. But typically, you can add modules onto a page, and you can put those modules into the content panes that are defined in these skins. The skins also typically don't necessarily have to have, but typically have the styles for your website, centralized JavaScript, and maybe navigation components. They can have more inside them, they can have less. It all depends on your use case, but that's typically how they're promoted. And then there's containers. Containers are another type of extension that basically wrap around a module. I don't necessarily or really use these all that often these days, but I think that they were initially brought in so that you could maybe change the styles of a module that you didn't necessarily have the source code to. So I've bought a commercial module or downloaded an open source one, and I want to change part of the maybe the look of it. I could use a custom container and wrap styles around that. Another typical use case, I believe, is to maybe show the title of a module above it. You can use a container for that. In the past, I've used them to turn modules into like an expander. So you hide the module and have a plus button so you can expand it. So there's some kind of typical use cases there. So if these are some of the common DNN building blocks, what other building blocks do we have available? So, I can't validate this, or I haven't validated this, but I believe it's probably pretty close to being true. Recently, I was on a call, the TAG group. It's the Architecture Advisory Group for DNN. One of the members on the call said in conversation, there is roughly 10,000 features in DNN. So if we go back to the original definition that any single feature in DNN is a building block, we have roughly 10,000 different building blocks available to us to build our solutions with.
Mike,
documentation.
Mike,
sorry?
Just a quick question. But I mean, those 10,000 features, you are going down to the level that, we have this API method and that API method and that API. I mean, you are going to the very...
I'm not going to be going down to that level in this presentation, and you'll see that in just a moment. But when I'm thinking about building solutions, I'm absolutely thinking about what's in the API. I used to think about in DNN only extension types. But then I found there's a lot of features in DNN that aren't just extension types and can be used in similar ways that are extensible. And that a lot of the challenges that I was running into delivering solutions were really taking these lower level details like certain API calls or certain types of functionality and using those to solve my challenges, not necessarily just a module.
And even...
We were just talking just before the meeting started about caching, and that's something that's kind of hard to implement. And there you go, it's there. There's a feature for it.
Exactly, and caching to me is a very important building block in building a website. So that's a great example, Daniel. That's one of those 10,000. And then when you talk about caching as a building block, you then have to break that down even more because we have client-side caching and we have server-side caching. And we have different types of server-side caching. So there's many different
places and data, and it's really complete.
So
exactly.
so Mike, really one of the many challenges is how that information becomes available to whoever wants to use. Because again, you see, Daniel didn't know about what you just mentioned to him, because I mean there is no, or I think there are some initiatives to have that sorted out, but I don't, to be honest, I don't know on top of my head a place that I can go and I can say, hey, I want to see all the APIs for DNN. I mean, we can dive into the codes, and that's how I did in the past. I said, hey, I want to see how DNN is doing this. So I went to the codes, I figured it out, and then I used that. That's how I used to discover things, you know.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly where my next bullet point here goes to. You know, that documentation, I do believe there is and I haven't been keeping up to date on it lately, as we mentioned earlier. My life has been consumed with getting ready for a baby. But there is an effort out there, I believe, to improve the documentation on DNN. I don't necessarily know what format that's going to be in and how that's going to be brought forward. Today, you know, the documentation exists in various forms. There's videos out there, such as this one that's going to go live after this meeting. There's blog posts, there's personal websites, there's business websites, there's books. There's a website out there that lists all of the DNN APIs. I think it's dnnapi.dnnsoftware.com. I thought that was the URL. It does exist, but it basically shows you all of the API calls, which is fantastic. Sorry?
I have some insight on this. Right now, there's two big efforts. Well, one is bigger than the other one. Documenting so much stuff is really, really a big project, and there's people working on it. There's an effort on revamping the documentation, and I'm trying every time I touch something. Like right now, I had to touch the cache, and there's a lot of methods, and they don't have the XML documentation. So when I see that, I go through that namespace and try to add XML documentation. That's going to serve two purposes. One of them will be inside of Visual Studio. When you start typing, you're going to get a little pop-up with what the method does and what parameters it accepts and what to expect from it. And I know the documentation project will be using DocFX to extract that data and also put it on a website. But that's not the only effort. There's also an effort in having human written documentation more extensive, but it's a huge project.
It's absolutely a huge project, and also keeping documentation up to date. You mentioned just to get it going is a huge initiative, and then like DNN's got 10,000 features, hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and it changes. There's new releases. You just mentioned we're doing a substantial one with 9.3 for the persona bar. How do you keep all this stuff up to date all the time? It's an absolutely big effort, especially for an open source project, which kind of takes me into my next point where I'm about to go to. How do you take that documentation and necessarily apply it to use cases? So what I mean by that is, that's great that you're documenting the Visual Studio XML definitions. Myself as a developer, I'm really going to appreciate that. So thank you, Daniel. But what that won't do for me is, I'm new to DNN, or I've been using it for a while and I'm just starting to do different things. It's not necessarily going to tell me what features I should use to solve my problem. Once I go find them, great, there's documentation for them. But, I'm not sure how you mentioned the documentation effort that's happening, the human readable one. I'm not sure what track that's going to take, but, an idea might be, hey, you want to do caching on your website? Here's the chunk of stuff for caching. Part of that is the API methods that you and I were just discussing, but part of it is a completely different set of API that isn't even in that namespace. Part of it might be something else. So what I've started to do is, instead of thinking about my feature building blocks, which I do think about, but instead of just jumping into, okay, what features do I need to use in my website, I started thinking about use cases. And what I've done on this slide here is documented just some web development use cases. So this list here, we're not going to go through it. It's just meant to kind of prove a point in that I think there's, this took me about 20 minutes to just brain dump onto the slide. And there's about 100 different bullet points here. Not all of these are going to be applicable to every website, but I'm pretty certain you could probably say all of them on there, except about a dozen, could be applicable to every single website. And I'm sure if with some effort, we could probably come up with another half dozen to a dozen slides with 100 bullet points on each of more web development use cases. And a lot of cases are things that every single website should probably have or think about, regardless of how big it is. So that's what I've done here, is kind of just thought about use cases. And I want to take those use cases. I've been doing it, as part of my kind of solution design, and then saying, okay, for example, if we look at the first one, how to adhere to W3C standards, what do I need to do? What features in DNN, what building blocks do I need to use to do that? For example, we're going to talk about in this presentation, SEO and the usability of URLs. So what building blocks do I have in DNN to help me get nice URLs? So as I kind of just mentioned, there's absolutely no way we can cover everything today for the 10,000 building blocks in DNN. So these four that I've listed here: SEO and URL usability, dynamic image processing, analytic engines and content injection, and core content management are just a couple topics that I'm going to do a little bit of a, not a deep dive, but maybe a medium dive, and give a little bit of information on them and demonstrate where in the system you can find these things and what they do. So let's start with the SEO and URL usability. And what I mean by that is, search engine optimization. So making sure we have URLs that search engine like Google or Bing want to see. But then also from a usability perspective, URLs that humans can read and understand and that are logical as well. Now, the two common things we have available to us in DNN are URL rewriting and URL redirects. Out of the box, DNN is configured with what's called the friendly URL provider. And I haven't actually dived too deep into this until recently and checked out to really see what you can do with it. And it affects your entire DNN website or application, all websites within it. And what I didn't actually realize is that because it's a provider, you can, I don't know how many people actually do this, but you can technically remove that provider from DNN and replace the whole thing with one that you've built or a third party to manage how your URLs are presented.
In addition to that, you can have more than one provider.
That was my question.
Can you
augment?
Totally. So the built-in one is mainly for pages and stuff and whatever it's there. Plus, let's say you have an e-commerce site and your product detail page is question mark product ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you can take that part and make it a URL provider to have product / television, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So we're just going to touch that one just a minute here. That's actually my third bullet point.
Cool.
That friendly URL provider out of the box has different modes. And what I found, which I didn't really understand, was that depending upon what mode you have it turned on, I think that there's like a basic mode, an advanced, and I think another one. But depending upon how it's configured, the rules that affect it are stored in different places. So there's a site urls.config file at the root of your application that you can use depending upon the mode that provider's enabled with to update rewrite rules. And there's also some of the rules that are stored in the portal settings tables as well. You can get to those. I think that you have to, out of the box, install a third-party extension if you want a GUI for it. But a lot of those rules are stored in the portals tables as well. Exactly what you were just alluding to a second ago, Daniel. There's extension URL providers as well in DNN, which you can, they're an extension type. So you can build a package and install it. And they're typically extension or module specific. So kind of what you just mentioned, if you have a store that has funny URLs, you could, whether you own that module or not, you could write your own URL provider that rewrites the query strings and turns them into a nice, friendly, readable URL. The example I like to use a lot of the time is, if I have a blog page or something, then I could take, say my URL was, mike.com/blog, and then each blog post was a query string with a question mark and an ID or something like that. You could then write a URL extension that rewrites that single module. However, those URL extensions, they're not necessarily module specific. If you don't want them to be, you can affect the entire application as well too.
And what's fun is that if you're having a commercial module for which you don't have the source code, you can still do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a pretty powerful system. I was reading a little bit about it, and I haven't built too many of those, to be honest. But you can set it up so that it'll only run the code if you're on a page. So basically, if I wrote a URL extension that says Daniel's store module, I only want to affect that module, then DNN will completely ignore this URL extension unless you're calling a page that Daniel's module is on. So it's got some power there in that you can kind of filter down, when should you execute and what conditions and things like that.
Mike,
Yeah.
Just a quick question. So, did you figure this out because you read about it, or because you dig into the codes and you sort it out? You open DNN, you open its insides and say, hey, this is how.
A mixture, actually. So at the end of the presentation, and I'll forward them to you, Anderson, I have a list of links for all the topics that we've talked about from some good documentation that I found online. In this case, there's actually a good chunk of pages, I think on DNN's wiki, that talks about these at a high level. What I typically do, because as we talked about earlier, the documentation in some cases is scattered a little bit or not as granular as I'd want it to be, then I'll dive into the code and kind of try and reverse engineer some of these things. That's what I did for the friendly URL provider. I didn't understand why on my DNN 8 website, there was a site urls.config file at the root, but in my fresh brand new DNN 9 website, there wasn't. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize that that's not there. So why is that the case? So that I had to dig through. I mean, it could be documented. I just didn't come across it. But for that kind of stuff, I usually dig through the code.
And one place to dig for code on DNN features like this, and those of 10,000 things that DNN can do, is the core modules. Up to some version of DNN, pretty much every new feature that came out was implemented in one of those modules. So it's a good place to just go on GitHub, search for cache, for instance, and you're going to see modules that use them and how they use them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Excuse me. The next thing that is typically used with URLs is URL redirects. So out of the box, and there could be more than just this. These are just two of the common areas that I'm more familiar with. You can, when you create a page in DNN, you can say whether this page is a page, or if it points to another page, or if it points to a third-party URL, or if it points to a file. So if you were looking at it from the database, you'd see a tabs table. And in DNN, whenever we say tabs, we mean pages. And in that table, every page is a record, and there's two fields of particular interest. One is the URL field. If you're not familiar with DNN and you see that, you'd probably think that means this is the URL for this page. It actually means that if this field is filled out, this page is a redirect. And it could be filled out with a ID of another page. DNN knows that if there's a number in there, it's an ID, so go try and find it. It also could be a file, I think it's file ID equals, and then DNN would know that, hey, I want to redirect you to a file, or it could just be a HTTP / your type URL, and it knows to send you to, this isn't in my website, it's somewhere else. By default, those are going to be temporary redirects unless the permanent redirect field is checked off, and then they'll get a permanent redirect. So that's kind of the easiest, most straightforward place in DNN to find redirects. There is, however, a tab URLs table, which I'm calling these page URLs. And what that does is you can actually load this table up with a variety of different types of URLs, and also indicate whether or not that URL is a 301 or a 302 type redirect. In DNN 9, this is exposed to the UI, and I'll show that in a minute here. But in previous versions of DNN, I don't believe there's any UI that showed, what URLs were in this table. So you ended up, in some cases, not really knowing what all of the redirects or the URLs were for some of your pages. I wasn't aware of this until actually a few years ago, but in some cases, if you rename a page in DNN, it will automatically create a redirect from the old page to the new one and store it in this table. That's great, great functionality. However, it doesn't necessarily tell you it's doing that. So there's a little bit of a usability concern there. My biggest challenge with that is that, if I'm working on a website that's not live yet, I could end up building, in some cases, a website that's got hundreds of redirects in it before I'm even live. And that can cause operational issues downstream when people try and create pages that they... Sorry?
There's a bit of story on how it got from not having that to having that, and why it was implemented that way. There used to be a module which was...
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's give us the background. It'd be great.
Yeah. There used to be a module which was URL master, I think. Was it URL master?
Yeah, the Infinity, I believe.
Infinity URL master, and that got acquired by DNN at some point, and they took those features and put them in the commercial edition.
Oh, okay.
I think it was the professional edition. So because there's the platform and the professional edition, the database needed to have the feature. So you could use it by going into the database. And with DNN 9, they brought some of that stuff into the persona bar as a UI. And in between, since it's open source, I think it's X3 Advanced URL Manager or something.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, so if you're on DNN 8 or something, you can install that module. That basically gives you the features that the DNN Professional had.
Cool. Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah.
I'm just going to load up here and kind of show the UI. My site's sleeping, so I'm actually already on the screen. But if you're in the page manager in the persona bar and selected a page and then went to advanced SEO, you can see here the URLs generated for this page, and you can add a URL from here as well. So you could, if you wanted to create, what's called a Vandy URL, or if you wanted to do some redirects, you could come in here and just add a URL. And there we go.
It's great for migrations too.
Yeah, exactly. Let me jump back in here. Well, that's spinning up. I'll just show you the table here. So this is a DNN 922 website, and there's that tab URLs table. And you can see in here that it stores the URLs, the status codes, you can have query strings, it supports multilingual. One thing that I didn't realize, but you can actually put URLs in here that have, you mentioned migrations, you could put a URL in here that has a .php extension or .html, and it will run as long as your website allows requests for those types of extensions. So you could load this up with something that wasn't even a .NET app, and use that for migration purposes too. Absolutely.
And what's great with the 301 is that the search engines will update to the new URL in the search indexes and stuff. It's really great for migrations.
Exactly. Yeah. You always want to make sure that if you're doing that type of thing, you're using the right status codes. So 301 is a permanent redirect that, as you mentioned, informs Google or any other crawler that, hey, this was my old address, here's my new one. And they will respect that and update their indexes accordingly, which is great. But yeah, in here, you can choose if it's a 301 or 200. The system actually does support 302s. I'm not sure why it wasn't added to the UI here. But if you put 302 in there, it does push for the right status code.
And the use case of 302 is a temporary redirect, is it?
Temporary redirect, exactly. So, if you are maybe just want to point something somewhere else for a couple days, a week, if you do that, then Google knows that, hey, we're not going to update that permanent record, that you're only doing this temporarily, exactly.
Like A/B testing would be a use
A/B
case.
testing, or if you're rebuilding something, I think there's a bunch of use cases there. This third one here that I want to mention, it's not a DNN built-in feature, but it's very common on ASP.NET websites. It's the IIS URL rewrite module. And what that lets you do is create rewrites or redirect rules outside of the DNN platform, still inside your application, but outside of the platform. I mentioned here that for my experience, I find this one is great for migrations because I can end up writing rules, maybe wildcard rules. So redirect everything in this section of the website to this over here. And it lets me also, I've worked on projects where I've had to redirect thousands of URLs. And we're not just talking about pages, we're talking about PDF documents and other things as well that people could download. Doing it in this manner, I find it a really great spot because then I can keep everything in one screen. And if the user decided to re-platform in the future or do some other types of things, then my DNN database doesn't have everything necessarily. It's outside of DNN. So that's another good, not DNN, another great tool as well to use for redirects.
What I use this the most is for SSL redirect. So if someone comes to the site without HTTPS, it redirects to the exact same place, but with HTTPS.
Awesome. Yeah, I do this exact same thing. A couple of the ones that I typically use that for as well is forcing www and forcing lowercase. DNN has in their rewriter some of this functionality to force lowercase and things like that, but it doesn't necessarily affect all of the URLs on that website. So it might from the DNN URLs, but not necessarily files or other things that you might do that are not DNN standards, we'll say. So I typically add those types of rules in this tool as well because it'll affect the entire application, whether or not I have something else inside of that besides DNN or not. So the next one here, this is something I found out only a few weeks ago, actually, and I've been pretty using heavily now. Dynamic image processing and manipulation. So I've actually struggled for a long time with making. I'm not a Photoshop wizard, but if I have images that I want to resize and maintain aspect ratios, or maybe I want to, have I'm doing a new build and I just want to have some stubbed out images, some placeholder images. I would typically go to Google and do a little search, download something. But there is actually a tool in DNN called the DNN Image Handler. It was brought into DNN in, I believe, 2015. So it's been around for about 3 years. But I didn't realize this was there until a blog post was posted on dnnsoftware.com back in August. I believe his name is Torsten. I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Torsten Wiegen, I believe, from Europe, is the gentleman who contributed that code in the blog post. And what it lets us do is basically from the DNN core, call a URL and pass in some parameters that will then let us dynamically change existing images. So like I mentioned, we can resize them, we can flip them upside down, we can make them black and white, so grayscale, generate images that are circles or triangles or all kinds of different things. And It has a load of configuration options, which I'm not going to cover. We probably need a whole session to go through it. But it's got a load of configuration options. It supports caching. So because it's dynamic, that probably, I haven't measured any performance criteria, but I could see how that would cause some performance issues on your website. So you can actually enable caching so that after you've initially resized an image, then that saves in the cache. So it doesn't need to do the work over and over again. You can also configure it to do things like, hey, only let my website use this functionality. So I don't want people to steal my images potentially. Then you can configure this to completely block requests from other websites, or to prevent things like abuse. You can set thresholds to say, hey, only let a client download this image a certain amount of times. It's pretty neat. I also found out actually today that this functionality is extensible. So it's not a DNN extension. So typically, and my thinking in the past was that the only extendable parts of DNN were the extensions, which I believe there are about 12 different types of. So the modules, the themes, the containers. But there's actually a lot of other parts in DNN that you can extend, but they're not an extension type. And this is one of them. I'll show you a reference here in a moment, but you can basically write a piece of code, and as long as you use the right base class, you can write your own image filters, basically. So you could, if you want to do things like dynamically inject watermarks into any image on your website, you could use this functionality to do that. So let's just jump over and do a quick demonstration of what we can do with this tool here.
Mike. Oh, sorry, Daniel, you're gonna.
I would just wanted to mention it's also used to generate profile pictures.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So if you need in your custom module, whatever, to show the profile picture, you can just call it with the user ID and you get a profile picture, and you can generate images from text too.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. If I'm just going to use this example right here. So this is, I believe, a photo of just myself, and I've cropped it. So if I didn't use this functionality, this image would be humongous. And if I didn't use the crop mode, I would get a really skewed looking image. And by using it this way, I can maintain the aspect ratio without modifying the existing image. I know in other platforms out there, sometimes their file manager will have capabilities so that after you upload an image, it'll give you a list of URLs if you want different sizes and shapes of it. While DNN doesn't give us that, from a UI's perspective, we can absolutely do it using this tool here. If I wanted this to be black and white, I just pass in the grayscale option, and dynamically my image is black and white. Same source image, just dynamically being processed.
So, Mike, quality-wise, quality is great when you resize, crop. I mean, it's very good, isn't it?
Yeah, so before I actually had known about this tool, I was trying to do it myself, and my images always looked kind of silly. But using this tool, it maintains the original aspect ratio when it resizes. So it's a lot easier. There's other solutions absolutely to do these things. But from my perspective, I can whip something up really quickly without having to go into Photoshop. In this case right here, I just dynamically generate a placeholder image. So, if I'm mocking up a new website, and as I mentioned earlier, I want just some images on the site to make it look okay when I'm showing a client, boom, I could do that. I can change the dimensions just by changing the query string. Daniel mentioned that you can put text on the images. I forget the query string parameter here, but if you put it in there, you replace 500 by 500 with whatever text you want.
I just know it exists, but I don't remember. But it's good for image coming soon. Let's say you have an e-commerce and the image product is missing. You can use that, and that's it.
Exactly, yeah. Some of the other filters you can do are change colors. So there we go. We just have a background color and a border color. So, I wouldn't release a production website with that image probably, or maybe I would. Maybe if I was, had a commercial tool or something and wanted to show, here's placeholder images on that, then you could use this as well. So I think there's a lot of different use cases for it, for sure.
Yeah, the text one could also be used. I'm just thinking if you're selling products with engraving or something.
Yeah, that's cool.
You can preview your engraving or something.
At the end of this presentation, and I don't know why I keep jumping back there. I have a link to the blog post, and also there's 2 blog posts actually. I think there's a little bit of duplicate data in them, but it goes through the whole thing about all the different parameter types. And shows you how to do the extensions as well. So it's a pretty powerful tool, and like I mentioned, I've been using it really heavily over the last few weeks, and now I'm adding it to my toolbox as a building block that I'm going to be using when building websites.
We have a note here from Mark Balzen. He is saying that your time is perfect, Mike, that he needs this right now for a project.
Awesome, Mark. Well, at the end of the show, at the end of the presentation, I'll point out the links there, and or if you just do a Google search for DNN Image Handler in the meantime, it's one of the top results, and hope you find it useful.
And it's funny because if you go back a couple months, I actually wrote a image handler for a DNN module because I didn't know there was one.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Well, mine doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but I needed to crop images, have smaller versions with caching and maintaining the aspect ratio and stuff. So I rewrote without knowing that it was available.
Gotcha. Well, this kind of takes me back. This kind of takes me back to my point about use cases earlier. If there's a way to say, hey, I want to manipulate images in DNN or manage them or do what to them, then maybe that type of stuff could help point out some of these things a bit better. People won't necessarily Google, DNN image handler. They might Google how to resize or whatever it is that you're doing. So yeah, that's great.
Mike, I think that you mentioned that this feature is on the platform since 2015, more or less.
2015, yeah, that's I can't definitively say that from just kind of doing some research. That's when all the posts about it came out, so I'm assuming that's when it was put in.
Okay, so we had a question, Steve. That's about 3 years now.
Yeah, 3 years exactly.
I think it started when what's the name of that skin? The first skin that had the profile picture next to the login and logout thing.
I'm not sure.
I think it started somewhere there. It was mainly for the profile pictures, and then it got improved for.
Oh, okay. If I
things.
find that webpage, there's a lot of features in it. Like I think there was, don't quote me, but I think there was something like 3 dozen different types of filter query string parameters that you could use to do all kinds of stuff with. So it seemed to be quite powerful. That kind of takes me to the next topic here, analytic engines. So what are analytic engines? Out of the box, I think most people that use DNN probably use the Google Analytics engine that's included with the core. That is at the, if you went to the root of your application and saw the site analytics.config file, that is used by this analytics engine as well. It is extensible, just like image handlers, but it's not a DNN extension. So if you go searching for DNN extensions in DNN, this is not going to show up there, just like the image handler does now, but this one won't. And it's another building block on DNN that's not your typical installable extension, but you can write your own analytic engines. What can you use them for? Well, as I just mentioned, out of the box, you can inject analytics in the pages. The core Google Analytics provider shows you an example of how to do that. But what I didn't realize until I actually dug through the code and started looking through this, you can have many analytic engines set up on DNN. And really, I think probably, I personally think it's probably named incorrectly because of the type of features and functionality it has. It actually lets you inject anything you want into every single web page in your application. So typically in the people might create a module or put a module on the page and display module on all pages to get that type of behavior, or modify your skin, or I believe in the site settings you can add in something into the page header perhaps. This functionality lets us do sort of the same thing, but because we're coding it, we can do whatever we want. We're not just left with a text box to put something into. So you could technically have a screen that let you inject other types of analytics, other types of codes, whatever you want really, and it supports token replacement as well. So you could write something that is somewhat dynamic as well. As I mentioned earlier,
live chat and MailChimp stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So as I mentioned earlier, where does the config live? The config lives at the root of your application, and it looks just like this here. And as you see here, it's XML, but it has engines. So you can have many of these analytic engines in here. And in order to use this thing, all you have to do is write your code that has a base class of, I believe it's analytic engine base, and then reference it in the XML here, and DNN will call this when the page is loading up and inject whatever is in your script template into the page. The engine actually will read what's in here and then send that to the back end, and you can do whatever you want to it. In this case, if you see these tracking ID tokens, that back end will then replace that with your Google Analytics ID for whatever you've defined, and that could theoretically put anything in here that you want.
One that supports the normal DNN token replace, right?
Yeah, when I was looking at it, it's not actually, it's not the core token replacement. This implementation was, you can see a bunch of if statements in the code, so it was like a custom token replacement, but you could have connected to that as well.
But you could get the tab ID or the URL or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you'd have full access to the pages in there and do whatever you want. One thing I liked about it quite nicely was you can say where it should be injected to. So I can actually pass the ID of an element, an HTML element, into it, and it will inject it into that element, whether it's at the top of it or at the bottom of it or whatever you want to do. So there's some pretty strong flexible behavior there. That's why I think personally it probably shouldn't be called an analytics engine, but more of an injection engine, because you can inject much more than analytics. It's significantly more flexible than that. Here is on GitHub. So this is the actual Google Analytics engine C# file. And this is the core implementation. So all you'd have to do to use this thing is write a class in C#, as I mentioned, that uses that analytics engine base, and then just override these methods like render script. And as I mentioned, you can see here, it's passing that chunk of a script template into it, and you can do whatever you want to it that you want. Yeah, it's pretty flexible. Down here is as I mentioned, you can see they're doing their token replacement, but you have full access to all of your DNN API, your user controller, your portal settings, your page, whatever you want. Technically, if you kind of care about that stuff, from a DNN perspective, there's a HTTP module that runs on every single page call that just kind of injects this stuff right into the pipeline. So you're not going to see this at all from the UI, but that's how it gets injected into the page. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't to say that you don't write a UI that interacts with this. In the case of this, in DNN 7 and 8, maybe even 6, there was a module that let you change the values that this would read. In DNN 9.3, that's coming out later this month, I guess, there is a DNN connector extension, which replaces that module, which lets you edit this data as well. So there's all kinds of flexibility for you that you could use to implement really whatever you want from an injection standpoint. Now I'm going to have to jump ahead again. All right. So this kind of takes me to the last building block that I want to talk about tonight. Well, that I can in the time that we've allotted tonight. core content management. So, DNN's a platform at the end of the day. A lot of people use it as a content management system. That's historically how it was promoted. But in recent years, it was rebranded and it was called the DNN platform. Probably because, we have a platform with 10,000 features and you can build much more than just a website on it. But from a CMS standpoint, one of the biggest pain points in my experience and from talking to a lot of people is that it lacks consistent content management amongst extensions. And what I mean by that is that typically different solutions on DNN store its data in different places. So from a core perspective, we have the HTML module. The HTML module stores its data in its own tables. If I went and downloaded a third-party extension, free or commercial, probably it stores its data in its own tables as well. But if we kind of step back and say, okay, what are our building blocks here? This is not an extension type. There is documentation on this, some good stuff too. I believe Scott Wilkinson has a few really good posts about this. And it's the content items and content types API. A few, I think it may have been, I don't know if it was on this on TADUG, Anderson, but I did a presentation on workflow in the past. And I think it was on TADUG actually. And workflow works hand in hand with the content items API. So why am I bringing up the content API? If you kind of step back and then think about what this is and look to find examples of it in DNN, you'll find that every single page in DNN is a content item. Every single module in DNN is a content item. Every single file in DNN can be a content item, depending upon your portal settings. So if you have workflow enabled for files, which yes, it does exist in the platform, it's just not exposed to the UI, then your files will become content items as well. So when I found that out, and when I think about that, at the core, at the heart of DNN, the basic types of content are content items. Interesting. And that content items API lets me assign metadata to a content item. It lets me do tagging to a content item. It even lets me upload attachments to a content item. And from my perspective, more importantly, it lets me do versioning and workflow to a content item. So it gets me thinking that, okay, I have some functionality that I've come across that has been here since I believe it was DNN 5. So I don't know off the top of my head when DNN 5 came out, but I'm probably going to say, 10 years ago? Maybe older? So for the past decade, we've had a central repository in DNN that the most common types of content in DNN use, but a lot of module extensions don't use this. Daniel, you mentioned that a lot of the core modules are some of the best examples of DNN API functionality. I believe the core blogging module does use this functionality to store part of the blog posts. So there are some extensions out there which are commonly used, which do use this, but the vast majority of modules that I've used or built or downloaded don't use this functionality. Instead, as I mentioned earlier, they kind of live on their own islands. And, I'm not necessarily suggesting that this implementation doesn't have flaws or couldn't be improved. Anything can be improved after you've used it for a while and found the pain points out. But we have at our disposal as a solution developer, a building block here that is at the core of DNN that supports a lot of the things that, at least from my experience, that my customers are complaining they don't have, which is full auditability of changes, which is versioning, which is workflow, tagging, metadata. So that's there at the core of our website. and is free and available for us to use and implement. So I'm just going to show you from the database perspective what that would look like. So if you went up here to this section here, you'll see, and this, like I mentioned, this has been here since DNN 5. There's been incremental improvements to it over the years. Like workflow was added at a core level in, I believe, 7.4.1. So that's still what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe even older. So workflow's been around for a while. But if we look here, we have a content items table. And I think I already selected everything out of it. Yeah, here you go. So here's the table. And if you look here, dashboard, extensions, skins, these are pages in DNN. If I scroll down a little bit, here's a module. It talks about the module ID and what page it's on. Journal entries, more things to do with pages. So lots of stuff is in here. Everything you basically put in DNN is here. Enter title. So that probably is an HTML module that's on this specific page, this specific page. If I scroll over, you can see if it was indexed or not. I did come across some documentation that said while there is an index flag, that the built-in search indexer may not crawl this data. So that could be a limitation. But if I go all the way to the right here, you can see state ID. So all of it is null. But if you're more interested in what that does, so that is the workflow ID. What state in a workflow does this content live? So, if we were using this as a solution developer to store our data, we now have a central repository that supports all kinds of stuff from the core API. We don't need to build custom tables per se. Some of the examples out there show that you can store your data in the content field. So, for example, we're storing the names of pages and modules, but there's nothing to stop me from storing a string of JSON that represents an object. Or if I still wanted to have a custom table for, because I want to do indexing on the database table or something else, I could store an ID in here that references another data repository and get all of that inherent awesomeness of workflow and versioning and tagging and attachments and whatnot. So very powerful, and in my mind, very underutilized. Go ahead.
And you can even add your own content types.
Yes, you can, exactly. Part of the workflow presentation I previously did has some links to some open source free sample code that I put on GitHub that shows you how to build a module that configures its own content types and then uses the API to store a custom object and also give it a workflow. So there are resources out there that show how to do this. There are some limitations, however, because in the platform edition currently, you can't create workflows or define workflows from the UI. You'd have to do it programmatically or through the database. But there are some initiatives to not in 9.3, but in the future version of DNN to bring workflow management into the persona bar. So you could then define workflows and whatnot. Part of my research, I actually came across, and I don't have it open here, but I have a link to it. 2 years ago in DNN Connect, I wasn't attending, but I came across the presentation. There was a gentleman who did a presentation on a website they built as a case study where they only used modules that supported content items. So at the end of the day, they end up having a very consistent website that pulled all of its data from the same spot, content items. And they actually, I wrote down here, they said that they have over 235,000 content items on their website. I went to the website, it was fast, it was performant, and sounds like they had all of the capabilities of tagging and workflow. And from a developer's perspective, just a simplified way of storing data. I like to simplify development as much as possible. It probably won't match every single use case. So once again, don't just pick this up and use it. You know, if you're crunching tons of numbers in a humongous database table for a specific need, maybe this isn't the right place. But if you're just storing some basic content using other building blocks that we have available, such as caching, I think it's a perfectly fine place to store a blob of JSON or something like that. The one here that's actually purple is the case study. So you can go there and see what they did. And they talk about how at the end of it, Content Item API was the MVP of their project. And that website is modern, it looks great, and still up there today. So yeah, thank you. That kind of takes me to the end of this presentation. I'm not sure if I mentioned at the start. I should have called this some of the building blocks in the DNN platform, just because, as mentioned, there's 10,000 features. But hopefully this gets you thinking in building blocks and not necessarily if you have been just in modules, themes, skins, etc. So thank you.
Mike, you mentioned the MVP. What is MVP?
Now, MVP can mean a bunch of different things, so I'm not sure the exact definition that they were referring to. I'm assuming they meant like this was the most valuable part of their project.
Well, most likely it's minimal viable product. Most likely.
Yeah, you know, that's what I thought too. But when I saw the end results, it definitely is a minimal product. It looks like a highly polished, good product. So maybe it's most valuable something. I don't know.
Maybe it was the maximum viable product, maybe.
Mike, awesome stuff. Awesome. I mean, again, I got so many interesting takes from the presentation. To be quite honest, I was thinking about the more obvious stuff, but again, you truly surprised me with a lot of what you added here. I mean, I didn't know about those things at all, and it opened up, my eyes.
Well, this just skims the surface. As we kind of pulled up that bolded list earlier and talked about 10,000 features, there are many other parts in DNN that you can do things with. And, I originally intended to talk about other parts of DNN as part of this presentation, but there's just so many pieces. I mentioned in my original intent was to talk about some of the events in DNN. There's the ability so that you can run, and this is not an extension type, but you can write a piece of code that every time a user logs in, it runs your custom code. Or every time you add a module to a page, it could run a piece of custom code. Every time a user got deleted. And this is without doing things like, hacking the DNN database and putting triggers and stuff. It's built into the core. It's just not documented in a way, it does exist in some way, shapes, or form, just not in the most in-your-face manner. And we could talk about this topic. We could have tonight's topic go on for a whole year probably and talk about these things. So
I get it. I mean, it reminds me of schedulers. I mean, again, schedulers is yet another one,
Yeah, exactly. Schedules in DNN. When you're talking about Let's Encrypt earlier, I was thinking in my mind, oh, geez, maybe you could just write a DNN scheduler that modified your website, so you could have that functionality living in your portable application. The possibilities are endless, and the biggest thing that I hope that you can take away from this is that DNN is such a feature-filled platform. There's so many tools. Daniel mentioned he rebuilt the wheel because he didn't know. I've done the same thing many times myself because you don't know necessarily. And there's a lot of power available to us. And
Awesome.
I did it a couple times to reinvent the wheel. I remember doing it for storing encrypted settings.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one.
You have the choice when you save a setting to have it normal or encrypted. It's built in. So
yeah,
I rebuild the wheel again.
I came across that today. I think what I was looking at today was with host settings. You could actually pass in a is secured flag. Awesome.
Whoa. Well, again, yet another one that is new to me. But again, it's all, I mean, I see so many potential for tutorials, for training. Again, my mind is always there. Anyway.
Yeah, well, my intent, and I don't by any means, but I would hope, my intent at the end of the day would hopefully be able to come up with some of these common use cases that I come across through daily work, and not necessarily redocument, but point to, hey, here's where some of this functionality exists, so that it can help people pick up some of these things without having to dig into the code and having to go searching for the functionality.
Awesome. Mike, again, very, very good. And I'll leave it open if there's any additional questions from anyone in the call right now. I think that there were some comments, but I think that the questions have been asked already. Mike, again, thanks so much for putting this together. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate the effort, the time, and I'm gonna get back here the presentation.
Awesome. Nope, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let me put it back here to myself, make me presenter. And this is really just a wrap up of things. There's not much else to be added here. I guess that you guys can see, as you can see my screen. So as I said, thank you very much, Mike. Questions have been asked already. And that's a wrap up. Mike, once again, I hope that, when we talk again, I don't know if you're going to be joining us for January, because I know that things will get busy for you, but our next one will not be the first week of January. It will be on the second week of January, because we need to get over the holiday season. So most likely on the 9th of January will be our next meeting, and most likely it will be with Andrew Hofflin. He'll be demonstrating some cool stuff. Most likely we're gonna be seeing some code in here, but I'm just finalizing his commitment right now. But as far as I know, for now, on the 9th, we're gonna be talking with Andrew Hofflin. Again, Mike, thank you very much. Have a safe delivery of your newborn, okay? I hope that all goes well, and keep me posted if you're not joining us on the 9th, or join us, and bring the baby as well. I mean, we can.
Yeah, I was just thinking I could probably use a break. I'm thinking, so I might be able to sneak away or bring her with me if she's sleeping.
But maybe you're gonna be doing this from Tim Hortons close by,
That's that could be the home office here. Probably might not be as quiet and relaxing as it is now, so I may have to sneak out to Tim's or Starbucks or something.
Yeah. That's it, guys. Again, thank you very much. We are wrapping up the meeting. Thank you, the ones that show up in person, virtually, but here right now. Thank you for you that is watching this afterwards. Let's see, there's a chat going on. Yes, thank you very much. Have a good one, guys. And again, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you guys believe there. I hope that you have a great holiday season and come back, renewed for 2019. We meet again the second week of January. Thank you very much. Have a great holiday season. Bye now.
See you guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.
Okay, Mike, again, thank you very much. Daniel, have a good one, guys.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Great season. Mike, keep me posted. Keep me posted. I want to hear the news, okay?
I'll keep you posted. I was just thinking, this time last year, I was sitting in Thailand in 32-degree weather, and now I'm sitting here in freezing cold Canada, about to have a kid. How life changes quickly.
See, next time you can still go there, but again, you're gonna have some extra luggage to carry,
Yes, exactly. I think kids get free flights until they're 2 or something.
Until they're 2 or 3, and then it's half after that.
Okay.
Until they are about 12, and then after 12 they go full price. Not right now. I'm going full price with my older one and half price with my younger one.
I'll make sure to take advantage of that while I can.
Mike, again, thank you very much. Daniel, good to see you. I'll see you guys in a month.
See you.
Cheers, guys.